Hi, yep, it's Nick from the podcast again. Just a quick upfront announcement this time that my Kickstarter for Death of a Necromancer actually finishes at 1 PM UK time on the day of release of this podcast. So if you had your eye on backing it, you may not have time to listen to this whole episode before doing so. But if you really have listened to it within minutes of us putting it up, then fair enough. Chill. And I'll remind you again at the end of the episode. As ever, the links to the Kickstarter, if you do want to rush off and back it, are in the show notes or on our website or on our social media about a million times. Thank you. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alistair.
And I'm Nick.
And in today's episode, we will be murdering many people in a darkly comic way in the name of peace with Peacemaker, and then we'll be ice skating across a bleak frozen tundra trying not to get shot in Black Crab. But before all of that, Nick, do you have anything to recommend to our listeners?
Well, after I finished watching Ted Lasso, which I think we discussed in the same segment a few episodes ago, I have decided to keep on Apple TV and move on to Dickinson, the sort of comedy drama series about the life of the poet Emily Dickinson, starring Hawkeye's very own Hailee Steinfeld in the lead role. This is a sort of post-Hamilton show, in that it's set in period American history, I think the mid-19th century, early mid-19th century, sort of pre-Civil War. But they're using modern music on the soundtrack and the characters talk in a lot of modern slang. It's very odd. It's very incongruous. There's some surreal sequences where she talks to giant bees and stuff. Yeah, it's a good show. It's a very strange show, and I can see why it maybe hasn't caught on to the extent that Ted Lasso has, but I feel like this deserves to be one of the sort of undercover hits of Apple TV. Maybe it's just because it's on Apple TV and no one's talking about it, but yeah, good series.
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot of buzz around this show. Well, kind of the people who like it seem to be really, really into it. I think it's got like a small, quite dedicated fan base. It seems to really connect with certain viewers.
Yeah, I remember a bit more buzz around it when it first launched. I think this was in the pre-Ted Lasso days of Apple TV. I think possibly the first few shows they did, there wasn't really a big standout hit, and this seemed to be one of the only ones that got a lot of like critical traction. But then, yeah, Ted Lasso came along and kind of became the big obvious hit, and maybe as a result I saw a bit less talk about this. But yeah, it's had 3 seasons, and I think it's now got an ending. It has, yeah, the 3rd season was the planned last one. But I'm only halfway through season 1, so I'm hoping the ending will be good. You know, it seems like it's a certain undercurrent of tragedy to it. I'm not necessarily expecting a happy ending. As ever, I know very little about the life of Emily Dickinson, except for the few bits that have been trailed in the show. So I have some idea that it's probably not going to end well, but I don't know many of the details.
Yeah, it's interesting that they've got this sort of modern style period setting, I suppose. It kind of reminds me of Bridgerton a bit, which I suppose uses period dialogue, but they've cast it race blind, so they've got, I don't know, people of colour playing like the Queen and things like that. So I guess it's part of a trend for historically inaccurate drama. That sounds really harsh to say it, to put it that way, but maybe like...
Yeah, I mean, in Dickinson, it's just that they talk in modern slang. Like, they haven't cast it race blind, I guess, because one of the main storylines seems to be the slow encroachment of the Civil War and intense discussion of slavery, and it might be a bit weird if it wasn't, clear who was white and who was black. I don't know. But yeah, as I say, it feels vaguely Hamilton-y if you ignore the fact that it's not a musical. Where's Bridgerton set in America? I'm not actually clever enough to know.
No, it's set in the Regency, Britain. It's, sort of Jane Austen times.
Okay, so on this occasion, they're actually covering British history, whereas this is an actual American period drama.
Yeah, but I guess there's part of this vogue, I suppose, of, people wanting historical dramas with a twist on it. Not basically, this is really, really accurate. It's like you've just stepped out of a time machine into the past. It's more like a sort of, clearly an interpretation of the past, possibly making like the sort of social dynamics or things more accessible by using modern slang or modern dialogue.
Yeah, there was a party sequence in, I think, episode 3, one of the ones we watched recently. And it's odd how much it reminded me of some of the party sequences in Euphoria, the way it was cut and edited. A strange dichotomy there.
I guess Euphoria sets the gold standard for party sequences.
Yeah, I mean, it probably helps for that they are using not dissimilar music on the soundtrack as well. So yeah, it's very strange, it's very incongruous, but it definitely has its own tone. And it's definitely got a nice take on the lead character in that she's allowed to be this sort of special creative soul, but the show is also aware that she's, sometimes kind of awful in her sort of self-involved, woe is I are so creative, none of you people, some of whom are slaves, can know my pain.
Yeah, that seems like the right tone to strike, I suppose. Not lionising the main character, but also giving you a window into them. I do really want to watch this show. I think, there's a couple of people on my Twitter timeline who are very into it and, constantly sort of tweeting clips from it and like kind of singing its praises. So I think, it may not be as high profile as Ted Lasso, but it seems to definitely be one that gets people who watch it really excited and interested. I mean, Hayley Steinfeld's great as well. I mean, I pretty much watch anything she's in.
Yeah, no, as I showcase for Hayley Steinfeld, it's really good. Like, obviously, she is Emily Dickinson. She's in most of it. Although it's got Ted Huss and Jane Krakowski as her parents, which is also very strong casting. Big fan of Ted Huss. He was in *Halt and Catch Fire*, which I watched the other year, and he was great in that as well.
Oh yeah, we covered that on the recommendation section of the podcast. Yeah, I think one of the things about Apple TV is that they've got Apple money, so they've like just thrown money at it to get like good people and high profile stars and things. Already stars on the rise.
Sorry, Toby Huss, not Ted Huss. I knew I had that name wrong. Anyway. But yeah, it's definitely quite a nice looking production. Obviously, I hear period is not cheap on the list of things you can film with your money.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, yeah.
Well, I think I've sometimes seen a bit of, is that green screen? But, I think everything's got some green screen in it nowadays. So yeah, if you've still got your Apple TV subscription and are looking for something else to watch after Ted Lasso, Dickinson, good show. Good show with an ending.
Sounds good. Yep. Sounds good.
Anyway, Alistair, what have you been watching while I've been educating myself through literature?
So I've been watching another show on a different streaming service, as we're fully into the streaming wars right now. It's just streaming service show versus streaming service show. And I've been diving into Moon Knight, which has just started on Disney+. So this is another Marvel comic adaptation. I think it's the first time that they've done a Marvel show that's on Disney+, not picking up a character from the broader MCU. This is a brand new character they've introduced, Moon Knight, played by Oscar Isaac. Yeah, he works in the British Museum gift shop, a sort of mild-mannered, quite shy, introverted person by day, but there's something strange going on in that he falls asleep and then he wakes up in other places and he meets people and they said like they had conversations or did things that he doesn't remember, and it becomes apparent over time that he has a superhero alternate identity. Yeah, I mean, so far it's all right. It's a bit slower paced than some other shows in that by the end of the second episode, it takes till really the end of the second episode to really kind of get into the plot. But there are some very good bits. Oscar Isaac is a very good actor and he really shows his range playing the different personalities in this character. His English accent is a bit all over the shop and it's sometimes incongruous when he says things like bruv, or I think there's one bit when he's fighting a monster and says, "You've come to my ends," or something like that, and it is a little cringe. But Oscar Isaac is giving it his all, so you got to respect that.
Yeah, I have also watched this, obviously, as I do. And yeah, I'm actually enjoying it a bit more than I expected to. I was expecting it to be a bit more, possibly pretentiously grim and gritty, but this being Marvel, I guess they don't do that. So yeah, it's surprisingly funny. Moon Knight, I'm enjoying it quite a lot. Yeah, there's just quite a lot of weird and awkward comedy moments, mostly connected to the lead character Stephen Grant realising he hasn't done that, or he hasn't had that conversation, or where'd that come from, or when he finally becomes Moon Knight and just falls down a lot, which is possibly not the biggest and cleverest comedy in the world, and I'm aware has annoyed some of the deadly serious Moon Knight fans online, but I found it quite entertaining.
I mean, I'm glad that they're sticking to the Marvel tone of kind of plenty of humour, underlying quips, and ultimately, I guess, not taking it too seriously so that you can sort of suspend your disbelief enough. I think a lot of the strength of the show is sold on Oscar Isaac's ability to do comedy and serious dramatic acting, oftentimes in the same scene.
It's interesting though because Oscar Isaac isn't snarky. Like, he's not a guy doing wisecracks. The jokes do have a slightly different tone to other Marvel shows because it's kind of, the joke is kind of that it's ludicrous or that it's cringeworthy or that sometimes just he's fallen down. There's not that much sort of snippy snappy back and forth.
Yeah, the tone in any way is probably a bit closer to Aquaman than to Iron Man, which kind of had a slightly more silly, slightly more like slapstick approach.
I mean, the thing is, this property, the Moon Knight IP, has a certain amount of space for sort of horror in it. You know, there's monsters, there's gods, there's weird things happening in the dark. Moon Knight himself is a bit of an intimidating, strange figure. And they're doing that a bit. I think some people feel that the comedy is undercutting it, but I do still think they've got some interesting sort of vaguely horror-y cuts of the god Khonshu lurking in the dark, which are quite fun.
That is quite scary. Yeah, this Egyptian deity that he sort of sees around the place, voiced by F. Murray Abraham, who does have a brilliant, deep, sort of sonorous voice. You know, that's quite good. I get the feeling it will become darker over time. They probably started with make it funnier at first, I guess, so to reassure people like this is a Marvel thing, that you get some jokes, but then over time I think there's potential for the show to go to quite a dark place. I mean, they also do seem to be exploring on some level like mental health I think they're kind of implying, at least on some level, that the main character has dissociative personality disorder. Yeah, that like exploring like how this is really affecting his life and the problems it causes. There is a slight thing which is one of his other personalities is a quite violent superhero, and I suppose there is this sort of thing with people who have very serious mental health conditions are much likely to hurt themselves than other people, whereas Moon Knight does hurt other people. I mean, bad guys, but still. But there is something interesting they are doing here with the effect that, like, having a serious mental health condition has on people.
Yes, I mean, obviously one of the interesting things that we're sort of hanging on this show for is how explicitly, I guess, it's going to bring the mental health stuff into it. I think in the comics they have gone ahead and said that Moon Knight has, dissociative personality disorder. Whether they get as specific as that here, I'm not sure. I mean, eventually, presumably, they're going to reveal, which of the personas came first, or maybe they won't. Who knows? Maybe they'll leave out a mystery. I like the fact that there is a lot we don't know. I feel like sometimes with these Marvel shows, they're a bit too prone to spoon feeding you stuff, except for like a couple of key things they're holding back for twists. And I do think that it's interesting that so much is being kept off screen. Like, there's a lot we don't know about this guy and who he is and what the hell's going on. And I like the fact that there's still stuff I'm interested to find out about.
Yeah, they're definitely building up a sense of mystery. Especially they introduced this other personality who's the sort of the badass one. You only see his life through Stephen's perception, so they're revealing it quite slowly, only when Stephen finds out things about this other person who is sort of sharing his head. That, I guess means that there's quite a lot of mystery to it, and I do like the fact that they've not just said straight up, like, this is the deal, this is what's going on. They're trusting the audience to stick with it and wait for the show to reveal its secrets in its own time.
Yeah, and I think, if they've got their 6 episodes, they've committed to that, so I guess they could afford to treat it that way. As a lot of these shows sometimes are, it is possibly sometimes suffer a bit from would this just have been better as a single movie syndrome, but I think I'll be able to evaluate that better once I've seen the whole thing.
Yeah, it's slow paced right now, but the pacing might pick up. I also think Ethan Hawke is very good as the sort of villain of the piece. He does sort of creepy villain quite well.
Yeah, no, he's really good. I think they've done quite well to get Oscar Isaac and Ethan Hawke in this. That's some strong thespian basis for the whole thing.
Yeah. So far I'm enjoying Moon Knight. I can imagine we will return to it.
We'll be back in a couple of episodes with The Hold of the Moon. Okay, and first up, this episode we'll be talking about Peacemaker, a series from HBO Max /DC /Warner Brothers. And this is a direct spin-off from last year's The Suicide Squad, a film which you may recall I liked a great deal, naming it my favourite film of the year. Was that a bit of an overreaction? I'm not sure. But nonetheless, I did really enjoy it. And this takes John Cena's character from that film, who I think did come across as one of the big scene-stealing characters in it. He's a sort of, I guess, a combination of The Punisher and Captain America. A guy who guns down a lot of people whilst insisting he's doing it in the name of peace and love. And here, after just about surviving the events of the Suicide Squad, despite getting beaten up, shot and blown up, he's now been recruited by a Black Ops squad to try and prevent an alien invasion, alongside a few cast returning from the Suicide Squad, along with new characters played by Danielle Brooks and Robert Patrick as his father. We have seen the whole series. Americans, of course, saw this whole series, I think, a few months ago, but bear with us. Alistair, what did you think of it?
If you liked The Suicide Squad, this is more of that. There's violence, there's a superhero story, it's got James Gunn's sort of dark humour. There's more to it than just the TV version of the Suicide Squad, but it's got the Suicide Squad plus TV things, so it's longer, it's focused on fewer characters, there's less budget and less famous people in it, but it gives more time to develop the character of Peacemaker into a fully formed human being and develop some of the other characters. And as you said in the intro, I think we both really enjoyed the Suicide Squad, so I did really enjoy this. I thought it was very funny and it had a good plot and it had all the things you sort of like from a sort of dark James Gunn humour plus superheroes, and I did enjoy the fact that they dug more into Peacemaker, his character, and the sort of themes around him, because they've got a lot more scope to do that in a TV show. Yeah,
as Alistair said, I really enjoyed the Suicide Squad, so it was perhaps almost inevitable I would enjoy this. It possibly didn't feel quite as much of a big, brash, different thing as the Suicide Squad did. I don't know if that's just because I'd already seen the Suicide Squad, or if, I don't know, it felt a bit less over the top in its silly cartoonishness. It didn't feel like it was quite as willing to just jerk into a ridiculously violent sequence out of nowhere. It felt a bit more like it was willing to be constrained by the rules of pacing and storytelling. It felt like a As someone who's watched a lot of sci-fi action superhero stories, it did feel like a somewhat regular sci-fi action superhero story, albeit very, very, very well executed, which I think is kind of the key here. It's incredibly well done, the jokes are good, the drama is very well timed, there's a good twist at the end of pretty much every episode, there's a strong character journey, especially with Peacemaker, but basically everyone gets their moments. So yeah, I don't know, it doesn't feel quite as exciting and new to me as the Suicide Squad perhaps did, but I do think that this is probably one of the best superhero shows I've seen of late.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we know what James Gunn's humour is now, and his approach. It's not too different to like the kind of darker James Gunn superhero things he did in the past, like Super and things like that. I mean, when we discussed the Suicide Squad, we said that like when he did the Guardians of the Galaxy films, he kind of toned down the sort of dark violence humor, to make his humor mesh more with the sort of Marvel formula, which isn't quite as dark as this is. Inevitably, it won't have that same impact that the Suicide Squad did, because we're aware of the kind of humor and we're aware of sort of what's going to happen tonally, so it wouldn't seem fresh. But that, that kind of humor, that combination works well. I'm definitely on board for more of it. And especially, like I say, the characters just seem more rounded. I mean, like, they take the fact that in the Suicide Squad, there's a bit when, after killing lots and lots of people, including some good guys, a character tells Peacemaker that he's a joke because he kills for peace. But obviously, he believes he's fighting for peace, but all he creates is carnage and destruction, the opposite of peace. And they kind of take that insult and turn it into a moment of self-awareness for Peacemaker, and then build a character arc out of that, which does work quite well.
Yeah, it's odd because it almost feels like quite a sudden about turn from Peacemaker's character in that film. But at the end of the day, fun though Peacemaker was in that film, that was kind of a not entirely three-dimensional one-joke performance in an ensemble. And here they've deepened it a bit and gone behind the mask a bit, and I think it was necessary. And John Cena's very, very good. He's one of many wrestlers coming through and becoming successful big action stars because, yeah, he's great in this. Does a lot to give emotional depth to it. You'll believe a wrestler can cry.
Yeah, no, he makes Peacemaker seem like a real person. And yeah, he, again, similar to what we were saying about Oscar Isaacs, he can do drama and he can do the comedy as well. So he's showing his range in this. And Peacemaker wasn't the main character in the Suicide Squad. His wasn't linked to the main sort of character arcs. I mean, like, Idris Elba's character, had a bigger change of, like, ultimately going from being a sort of a bad guy coming around to do the right thing. Peacemaker was a secondary character. In this, they've got a similar arc of he comes around to doing the right thing. And they kind of dig into him more. I mean, one of the things they do in this show is they contrast Peacemaker with his father, which makes him seem much more sympathetic. You may think Peacemaker he's violent, he's a bit of an asshole in the way he treats people. He's sort of unpleasant, he's violent, he creates carnage, he's supposed to be creating peace, but actually he creates destruction. It's very one-sided. He doesn't really care about the people he hurts and all these things. But when you contrast him to his father, who is a openly white supremacist, Nazi, redneck mass murderer, you then have more sympathy for Peacemaker when you find out where he comes from.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's on some level, I guess it might come across as a bit shock jock on James Gunn's part to go full white supremacist, borderline Nazi for his father. But when the character you're trying to redeem is, as you say, as far out there as Peacemaker was, I guess maybe you kind of have to go there, and it does work in this. Robert Patrick committing admirably to the grimness of that character.
Yeah, this is one of the questions I had because I really don't know DC that well, and is that how much of this is true to the character in the comic? Is Peacemaker's father a white supremacist supervillain called White Knight? Or is this just something they made up for the show?
White Dragon, isn't it? Pretty sure that a lot of this is made up for the show. That sound you may hear is me glancing through the Wikipedia page. Yeah, the answer to this is no. I don't think there's really that much dramatic similarity to the comics version. I think this is one of those examples where they've very much taken the comics version as a bit of a jumping off point and sort of rebuilt the character around John Cena's performance and around what James Gunn needs for his story.
Yeah, I mean, it does work. I mean, as they develop Peacemaker's character, they're very much doing the kind of character reveal of, on the surface, he's an arsehole, violently destructive, but then underneath, he's a nice guy who wants to do the right thing, is kind of the big character reveal. And a lot of his arsehole-y tendencies on the surface come from, his appalling father, which is, a redemptive character arc compared to what he was like in the Suicide Squad.
Oh yeah, his appalling father, the bad company he keeps, the lack of any opportunity. Yeah, it's a surprisingly complex story. It's also, to be fair, very entertaining and funny. Like, this isn't, a venting emotional drama. There's a lot of people exchanging silly banter and stuff getting blown up. James Gunn is very good at this sort of jerk from silly to sad to extreme violence and sort of back and forth between those settings relentlessly.
Yeah, and they introduce a lot of characters who are comedy relief sidekicks. There's Peacemaker's sidekick, I guess, vigilante who's just a sort of psychopath, sort of who just likes murdering people, but is also generally a bit of a weird guy. There's a character called Judo Master who it just leads to some quite slapstick fight sequences. And he's also best friends with an eagle called Eagerly, who's surprisingly sweet and gives him hugs and things like that. It's got a sort of, I don't know, it's a slightly odd edge to it at moments, in that sometimes it goes into just kind of bits that are a bit weird.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to see them on the one hand doing, very much superheroes for mature audiences, in that they keep swearing and bloodily slaughtering people. But they're also, this is, to be fair, something he very much did in the Suicide Squad. It's also very much accepting the sillier aspects of superheroes. Like in the Suicide Squad, he had that human weasel and arm fall off man, or whatever his name was, and a bunch of other really stupid DC superhero concepts thrown into these bloody stories, and he's doing it again here,
Yeah.
I enjoyed Vigilante, actually, the Freddie Stromer character, who is, I guess, kind of another vaguely Punisher-esque character. If there's a commentary being done here, it's, it's the old song that a lot of the characters who do sort of Punisher-type things would have to be varying flavours of traumatised or just flat-out disconnected from humanity. Like, Peacemaker is clearly just, traumatised and mentally ill to an excessive degree, and Vigilante just seems to really struggle to relate to people as a human being.
Yeah, he's basement-dwelling weirdo.
Yeah. None of these people are cool, I think, is the point.
Yeah, or well-adjusted. I think.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And it's kind of weird, because the kind of way, I guess, and James Gunn is good at doing these, like, extreme about-faces. There'll be something quite silly, superhero sci-fi-y, such as they'll be fighting a man called Judo Master, who like wears, like, a bright green costume with, like, a dragon symbol on it. And there's also a large plot line involving alien bugs that crawl into people's heads and control them. It'll be all quite silly. And then there'll be someone getting shot in the head very violently and with a very accurate rendition of bits of skull and brain being splattered over the wall. And it's a bit of an about take to, like, this was kind of silly and now it's, like, deadly serious.
Well, yeah, and then someone will have an emotional moment about it. Yeah. It was impressive in Suicide Squad, and if anything, it's more impressive here, because I think there were emotional moments in Suicide Squad which did work. I think he's even more pivoting into that here, which just makes the about turns even more extreme. I guess that might be one reason why he doesn't go quite as far into the extreme violence as he did in Suicide Squad, because there's a bit more attempt at serious emotion here, but still.
Yeah. There is a lot of violence, and there's several scenes where people get caked in blood from, like, head to toe and stuff. And then just kind of sit around having character moments covered in, like, other characters' brains. You kind of buy into it at the time, but then later you think about, like, that's really odd.
Yeah, and the classic beat, which I always enjoy, where two characters in the middle of a deadly serious moment just start having really stupid, idiotic arguments. There's a lot of that in Orange is the New Black, fansibly. I enjoy it there, and I enjoyed it here.
Yeah. And
of course, speaking of Orange is the New Black, we also have Danielle Brooks as one of the main sort of human POV characters, who's very good, as she always is.
Yeah, it was great to see her getting more work, and yeah, she's really funny in this, again, as a regular person who gets swept up in this bizarre superhero story and is a kind of the straight person to, the silliness of all the superhero characters.
Yeah, I mean, everyone here is a bit weird, but there's some. She's probably the closest to a sort of normal, relatable POV character.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's a reasonably big cast here. I mean, increasingly we're seeing a lot of this sort of shortish miniseries, 6 to 8 episode superhero story. I don't know whether this is people copying the Marvel Disney Plus formula or not, but we seem to be getting more of these. And yeah, I think this one is interesting because it's actually got quite a large cast of characters, all of whom have story arcs. It actually seems quite busy and heavily populated, whereas the Marvel ones sometimes seem a bit sparse. Like, there's only 4 or 5, if that, major characters. A lot of them don't have that much to do.
I mean, there's quite a lot of plot in this. There's the plot with the father, there's the plot with the alien bugs crawling into people's heads, there's the plot with Peacemaker's character, there's all these relations to other characters, Vigilante, the Adebayo character, the kind of other people on the squad, his relationship with all those other people. So there is actually, quite a lot of plot here, and quite a lot of characters to facilitate all that plot.
Well, yeah, which is good, because it does mean this doesn't feel as much like a stretched out movie as some of these do.
Yeah, and I think when we reviewed, like, Luke Cage and Jessica Jones, those Netflix Marvel collaborations, a lot of the time we said, like, at kind of 12, 13 episodes, they were too long, really, and they were quite slow in the middle, whereas I think Disney Plus have realised that and kind of cracked them down to kind of 6 to 8 episodes is a better length for this sort of thing.
Well, yeah, because that way, you can have at least one, like, action scene in every episode, hopefully, and you don't have to just have long scenes where people sit around the same sets having interminable conversations, or go on long fucking busy work errands to learn things that the audience already knows, just to drag out the series.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess they're responding to the critical reviews. So I hope in some small way we've contributed to the improvement of the superhero media.
Yeah, I'm sure Kevin Feige and whoever the DC version of Kevin Feige is have listened to our podcast intensely.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this is one of the better superhero things of our times. I enjoyed this a lot. There's a second season coming, apparently, with James Gunn coming back. I will obviously be watching that.
Yeah, I did like the opening credit sequence also, just made me like fall to bits laughing every time. It has, at the beginning, and it's really worth looking up on YouTube, a song and dance opening sequence in which Peacemaker and all the other characters from the show do kind of TikTok-esque dance moves to Do You Want to Taste It by Wigwam. And including like various bits when like the police come in wearing their kind of police uniforms and badges and look kind of confused whilst they dance. It is hilarious in every episode.
Well, yeah, like everyone's got their respective costumes from whatever bit of the plot they're in on them, and they're all just doing these sort of weird, serious facial expressions whilst they dance. It's very, very, very odd, but it has deservedly, I think, gone kind of viral because yes, it is very, very good. It's been a while since we had a genuinely enjoyable opening sequence like this, partly because a lot of shows just skip them entirely and just flash up the title now, it seems.
Yeah, to save time.
Save time, save people having to press the skip intro button. But yeah, I respect this. This is extremely good. I may have watched this on YouTube for entertainment a couple of times.
Yeah, and I always enjoy, it's something to look forward to when you stick on a new episode. And one of the other things I liked about the show is that one of the things they introduced is that like Peacemaker is a big fan of like hair metal and like glam rock and things like that. And the whole show has a sort of 80s glam rock kind of hair metal soundtrack, which, although it's not really a particular genre of music I like, you know, that sort of heavy metal and things like that, I always find it, I don't know, a bit too laced of irony. I prefer punk, which seems, I don't know, a bit more authentic. But I did like that the show had a real like aesthetic choice to its music. It didn't just choose pop songs. It chose like the music was all of a specific genre and it related to the character. And I thought that actually really worked as a creative decision.
Well, yeah, but obviously having put some thought into the music is not a new thing for a James Gunn project. That's very much something he has been known to do. But yeah, it's very much on display here.
Yeah, and I assume James Gunn probably is like a fan of that type of music because there's a lot of like details of like obscure glam rock bands and things like that. And long scenes where people have conversations over vinyl and stuff. But I did like, again, having a specific aesthetic that's also related to the character is just like enhances the experience. Even though it's not a style of music I like that it was like consistent.
Well, yeah, it makes it feel like this show and this character have something specific to them and something that you can actually get here that you can't get in every other fucking superhero show, which does do a lot for it.
Yeah, a lot of stuff to like here. I know, I'm thinking a lot about trying to untangle the politics of this show, and it's kind of difficult in that, on some level, it is about how Peacemaker, who represents the American state, is just violent and destructive and incredibly self-absorbed, and then justifies it with appeals to supposedly higher values of justice. And I do kind of like the satire of that they are kind of satiring the American military-industrial complex. But at the same time, the ultimate message is underneath it all, Peacemaker is a good guy he's just a nice guy who wants to do the right thing really, really hard and sometimes does stupid things, which is, there's something, I don't know, almost saying that like underneath the violence and destruction of the American military-industrial complex, there's just good guys trying to do the right thing. I don't know if I buy into that.
I don't know. I've heard the satire was a bit sharper in that way in the Suicide Squad. I think here he's maybe gone a bit more specifically into the character of Peacemaker, which makes it harder for him to be a metaphor for America.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah, you're right. That by making him a three-dimensional character, we have to introduce something sympathetic to him. And if he's also going to be the embodiment of the American military-industrial complex, then it has to be sympathetic on some level, because the point of the show is not also to satirize the military-industrial complex. It's to tell, an engaging superhero story. Although there is plenty of satire of how destructive and violent Peacemaker is needlessly and how self-aggrandizing he is. I was on board for that, certainly.
There was the big moment at the end, which I see no need to spoil, where Peacemaker makes a big decision, which is, on some level, kind of morally interesting, but I don't know if it's really making any particular big statements about the show itself in doing so.
I think that was more of a character moment than a political statement, I would say.
Well, again, yeah. So I guess, yeah, if anything, yes, maybe that's the point here. This really is more of a character study of Peacemaker than a political statement.
Yeah, but it works on that level, so I definitely enjoyed it.
Okay, and last up today, it's Black Crab, a Swedish action film on Netflix, directed by Adam Berg, starring Noomi Rapace. And this is an action film about a squadron of elite soldiers in a post-apocalyptic world where an unspecified invading force has invaded Sweden. I assume it's Sweden. And in order to combat this invasion, this elite force must take a mysterious canister across a sheet of ice. to a mysterious base. It's all very mysterious. We have seen this film. Alistair, what did you think?
We were talking about in Peacemaker about how, there's kind of humour and then some very violent and bloody realistic like shooting sequences. So this film is kind of those violent realistic shooting sequences, but obviously without the humour and a very dark tone. I mean, we've chosen 2 things to review this week, which does involve people getting shot in the head and like blood going everywhere. But this is really, a textbook sort of dystopian film, and I think it's really riffing on this kind of anxieties we have about societies on the verge of collapse and sort of civil war, and how violent these things can become. We were talking recently about how in the aughts we had like dark culture for optimistic times, dark and gritty James Bond, dark and gritty Batman, and now some people kind of want lighter culture for dark times, whereas this is definitely dark culture for and about dark times.
Yeah, this is definitely a pretty grim film. This is probably the closest to the sort of bummer nihilism levels of the Garth Ennis Punisher that I've seen in media for a while. If you want a sense of escapism from depressing war news, don't watch this. There's none of that to be had here. But yeah, as sort of depressing Band of Brothers war films go, it's pretty enjoyable. The ice angle is an interesting departure. I like how we sort of slowly realise just how mentally screwed in the head the lead is. Like, there's an interesting sort of reversal in how she starts off as this determined hero, and by the end you realise that she's actually, closer to a genuinely deranged, single-minded lunatic along the lines of the Punisher. It's impressive.
Yeah, there's quite a few good reveals character-wise, and the characterisation is quite subtle. There's not long bits of dialogue digging into the characters, but over time you do really get into her mental state, and through some brief but quite deftly done flashbacks it kind of fills in the deal with her. I'm dancing around saying it explicitly, we might say it later in the review, but it's best, I guess, watching this film not knowing some of the character beats later in the film.
Yeah, and again, tiptoeing around the spoilers, but the end of this film to me was probably the best part, or one of the best parts. Like, I found the concept of going on this mission across ice quite interesting, but the execution, to be honest, got a bit samey after a while. I didn't necessarily love that part.
Yeah, it's very beautifully shot, and there's something very almost like balletic about it, in that they have to cross this frozen archipelago on ice skates, and this sort of the Black Crab squad for this have all been chosen because they're in the army and they've all got experience of ice skating. So this sort of ragtag group of people, like one of them is like a hockey player and things like that. They've all got experience of ice skating. And then there's lots of shots of them ice skating through this bleak, frozen wilderness. And it's obviously a very, the sort of bleak photography and the landscape they're traveling through matches the bleak feel and tone of this film about society that is kind of completely tearing itself apart. So I thought that really worked. But yeah, it's a 2-hour film and there is a lot of frozen wilderness.
Yeah, I didn't individually hate any separate part, but by the time we finally got to the part where the plot moved on from the frozen wilderness, I was very much ready for it. Yeah, it does. I know this is a bit of a regular mention for me, but I could have done with a bit less of this film. 2 hours was probably more than I needed.
Yeah, it is long considering it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, both characterization wise and kind of world building. But I did like about how minimalistic the world building and the character was. Like, I was really worried at some point there was going to be like a really awkward, like clunky bit of exposition and filling in, which there wasn't. I mean, the military conflict that's kind of the backdrop to this film is a civil war. Or it's, again, you don't really find out what it's about. There's 2 factions, always just referred to as us and them. There's a sort of, I don't know, stylistic thing, whereas the other side seems to wear a lot of white or snow camo, and the main side, the side the character on, seems to wear a lot of black and dark colours. But you never find out what the 2 sides are beyond they're called us and them. You never find out what caused the conflict. It's implied at one point by something you hear on the radio that it's a civil war. It's not an invasion, but it's never really revealed. It's not really explained how it happened or what. It's just kind of very much in the background. The characters know exactly what happens and they don't discuss it. And there's not much exposition about the characters' backgrounds. They all know their stories, but they don't, again, discuss them. And it is quite realistic how, there's no clunky exposition. And I did like that. And it's kind of left for you to fill in the blanks about what is the nature of this conflict that's kind of destroyed Sweden, if not the world.
I guess the problem is, on the one hand, that kind of becomes, something you could just read anything onto. On the other, it makes it feel faintly generic. Like, a lot of the characters who aren't the lead character don't get that much specific characterization. There's a couple of them get sort of, memorable personality to the extent that you remember what they're like and feel sad when they die. But that's kind of about it. I don't know. I felt the film was a bit long for how generic a lot of the stuff was.
Yeah, but I guess it kind of made it feel realistic in that I could very much believe in this conflict. It didn't seem... But yeah...
But there was nothing to disprove any one angle.
Yeah, well, there's nothing that made it seem particularly fake.
Yeah, it's fine. It's
There are some like very tense bits, especially early on, involving like before they get on the ice, going through the cities and things like that, and seeing how destroyed they are. And I guess with the Russian invasion of Ukraine being in the news and things there, they're like, it is, again reflecting the darkness of the times we live in. We're again seeing this film where there's like urban environments totally destroyed, devastated by war. Again, people just like at each other's throats. Lots of urban combat, people fighting each other, lots of desperate civilians and refugees caught up in it. There's sort of bits where people are clearly being massacred or like left hanging from bridges, and it's quite disturbingly how this film captures what's going on in sort of Ukraine right now. And it's weird that they must have been making this film a while ago, so it's just a coincidence, but it does certainly rhyme with current events.
Yeah, I think whilst watching the first 20 minutes, half hour of setup, it was definitely hard not to think about that, as I said earlier. Not the escapist media you're after.
No, exactly, yeah. Yeah, there's something about, again, like we've been shown a lot of like kind of European cities destroyed by war recently, and now this is a film reflecting that. Yeah, it is just sort of disturbing to see. So yeah, it adds to the, again, very dark tone of this film.
Yeah, I mean, if this is a film reflecting the way the world is now increasingly going, then again, it's a very depressing, nihilistic film in places, so bummer.
Yeah, and we are getting a lot of sort of dystopian culture in dark times. So yeah, there's definitely, as the world seems to spin more out of control and get worse, there's obviously a lot of dystopian films, TVs and stuff to reflect that. I do think that we can overdose on dystopian TV and films and culture because they ultimately are quite bleak and don't really encourage people to strive to improve the world. So I do, appreciate that if people are trying to create a film or something that's got a political message in it, the obvious thing to do will set it in a future dystopia as a sort of grim warning. But if anything, what might prompt people to improve the world is actually more culture set in optimistic or utopian futures, or at least better futures, to inspire some change rather than just make everyone feel depressed all the time.
Yeah, I know you've been more involved with things like solar punk than me. I'm sure the optimistic futures are coming. I'm trying to think of an example of one, but nothing's coming to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's various examples of, culture that's trying to push back against kind of dystopian culture. I mean, there's solar punk, which is a kind of the antidote to cyberpunk. Rather than like futures where kind of the environment's been destroyed and it's grim and oppressive, do stories set in optimistic, environmentally friendly futures. Not like perfect futures where everything's sorted. There's still crime or tension and drama to create interesting stories, but where it's very much like a more optimistic vision of the future to encourage people to fight for a better future. Because if people are depressed all the time by grim visions of the future, I don't think it will encourage them to make a better future, and then inevitably we'll slide into actual dystopia rather than just the dystopia we see on TV.
Yeah, no, I didn't really come out of this film feeling inspired to make a better future. I mostly just felt a bit depressed, really.
Yeah.
Depressed and with the vague memory of being a bit bored.
Yeah, so if you're depressed by the news and want to be depressed by fiction, we can recommend this.
Yeah, if you want enjoyable violence, then go and watch Peacemaker.
That's all we've had time for. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please leave us a review in your podcast provider of choice to spread the word. You can also visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, to find every other episode of the podcast, bonus audio clips, and short written pieces by Nick and myself.
And if you want still more from Alistair and myself, you can go to MFV Podcast on Twitter or Moderate Fantasy Violence on Facebook for the very latest updates in our cultural consumption and the release of this podcast. And if you want more from me, you can go to NickMB on Twitter or nickbryan.com. And most importantly at the moment, well, as of the release of this episode, there are about 3 or 4 hours left in my Kickstarter for my Death of a Necromancer graphic novel, so please consider backing that if you're at all minded to enjoy my comics. It's a good, fun, grisly time, and yes, as I say, you've got about 3 or 4 hours, so hurry.
I've been Alistair Ball. You can get more of my writing at redtrainblog.com or find me on Twitter where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball. You can join us next time on the podcast when we'll be seeking bloody revenge in Robert Edgar's The Northman, and we'll also be travelling through time in the Doctor Who Easter special, The Legend of the Sea Devils. Join us in 2 weeks' time to find out what we made of those. Until then, goodbye.
Bye. We'll be back in a couple of episodes with The Hold of the Moon.
Put that song in at this point.
Do, 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 do.
You saw the whole of the moon.
Night.